Hi there, Mr. Holcomb here with another episode of The Math Behind the Modules. This is Lesson 13, Populations, Samples, and Generalizing from a Sample to a Population. Classwork. In this lesson, you will learn about collecting data from a sample that is selected from a population. You'll also learn about summary values for both a population and a sample, and think about what can be learned about the population by looking at a sample from that population. So exercise 1 through 4 says collecting data. Describe what you would do if you had to collect data to investigate the following statistical questions using either a sample statistic or a population characteristic. Explain your reasoning in each case. So here we go. Okay, so it says, describe what you would do if you had to collect data to investigate the following statistical questions using either a sample statistic or a population characteristic. Explain your reasoning in each case. A says, how might you collect data to answer the question, does the soup taste good? So off to the right here, I've got a little table here, and we've got a population, and we have a sample. So the population in this case would be the whole pot of soup. The sample would be a teaspoon of that soup, a portion of it. Okay, so it says, how might you collect data to answer the question, does the soup taste good? So you have a population, a pot, you have a sample, a teaspoon of soup. Okay, so taste a teaspoon of soup to check the seasoning. Does it taste good? Then it says, how might you collect data to answer this question? How many movies do students in your class see in a month? And we might answer, so we could ask students to write down how many movies they have seen that month and collect their responses. C, how might you collect data to answer this question? What is the median price of a home in our town? Okay, how about find the price of homes listed in the newspaper and use those data to estimate the median price. Another option is to go to a realty office and get prices for the homes they have listed for sale. The difference between those two, though, is what you ask for your home and what you get are two different things. So you can go to the town hall and get the tax records of your town. That is legal knowledge, or that's public knowledge. You could get the tax records of your town and see how much every house sold for. That would be more accurate. Because what they list, I could list a house for $500,000, but no one buys it, so I drop the price to $400,000 or $300,000, and finally I get a sale for it. So what people ask and what people sell it for are two different things. Alright, so D, how might you collect data to answer your question? How many pets do people own in my neighborhood? Okay, so answers might vary on this one depending on where students live. If students live in an urban area with high-rise apartment buildings, asking some people on each floor of the building, unless it is not a pet-friendly building, or people as they go to work in the morning, those living in the suburban or rural areas might go door to door and ask their neighbors. So depending on the type of neighborhood, the way you're going to collect your data is going to be different, is what they're saying. So E, how might you collect data to answer this question? What is the typical number of absences in math classes at your school on a given day? And here we go. Ask each math teacher how many students were absent in each of their math classes for a given day. So in this school where I am, we have 5 math teachers. So that'd be really easy to do. Go to all 5 teachers and say how many were absent in your classes today, and they can tell you. All right, E is done. F, how might you collect data for this question? What is the typical lifespan of a particular brand of flashlight batteries? Okay, I'm going to go back to this here, and it says population would be all batteries of a certain brand, and the sample could be the group of batteries put in flashlights and time to determine how long they last. So the answer to this would be put some batteries of a particular brand in flashlights and time how long they last. G, how might you collect data to answer this question? What percentage of girls and of boys in your school have a curfew? Okay, so what you could do here is ask all students if they have a curfew. No. Students may find it challenging to ask everyone in the school the question, especially students at large schools. Let students describe how they could use a sample. For example, asking a group of students selected at random from a school directory to answer the question. Now, the question I got when I was doing this in class was, what does curfew mean? That means, is there a time you have to be in at night? You know, if you're not through that door by 9 p.m., you're grounded. That would be a curfew. All right, H. How might you collect data to answer the question, what is the most common blood type of students in my class? Okay, in this case, all you have to do is ask your classmates about their blood type. This was a question that I asked in class, but there weren't many. Of the 15, I think only 2 or 3 knew their blood type. And that's normal for a young person, because why would you know your blood type? But if you turn 18 and you want to give blood, and you meet the weight restrictions and everything else, you're healthy and they will take your blood. When they take your blood, they will tell you what blood type you are. So if you have given blood, that's how you find out what type you are. Okay. Number 4. Make up a result you might get in response to the situations in exercise 1 and identify whether the result would be based on population characteristic or a sample. Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to bring all these answers in at the same time because there's several of them, and it just will be quicker if I just pause the video, put all the answers down, and then read them off. Okay, I realized in my video that I put this in the wrong place. How might you collect data to answer the question, what's the most common blood type? Ask students in my class. And then I skipped this. I thought I was at the end of my page, so let me do this first, and then I'll go back to the solutions of the next. So it says a population is the entire set of objects, example, people, animals, plants, from which data might be collected. A sample is a subset of that population. Numerical summary values calculated during data from an entire population are called population characteristics. Numerical summary values calculated using data from a sample is called a statistic. So population characteristics is when every single person in the population is asked, whereas if we have a sample, then they are called a statistic. For which of the scenarios in exercise 1 did you describe collecting data from a population and which from a sample? Okay, answers would vary in the situation depending on the responses, but students should indicate that data on how the soup tastes, median home cost, number of pets, and battery life might be collected from a sample. Data on the average number of movies, number of absent from a math class, and most common blood type might be collected from the entire population. 3. Think about collecting data in the scenarios above. Give at least 2 reasons you might want to collect data from a sample rather than from the entire population. Okay, so if you used the whole population, you might use it all up like in the soup and the batteries examples. In some cases, a sample can give you all of the information you need. For instance, you only need a sample of soup to determine if the soup in the pot is good because it is the same all the way through. Sometimes it's too hard to collect the data for an entire population. It might cost too much or take too long to ask everyone in a population. Okay, now let's go on to the next questions that I had here. And here's number 4A. Does the soup taste good? Identify whether the result would be based on population characteristic or a sample. So here it says, yes, but it needs more salt. A spoonful of soup would be similar to a statistic. Although it is not really a statistic, it is based on a sample, so in that way it is like a statistic. Okay, so here we go. B, how many movies do students in your class see in a month? The mean number of movies was 5, population characteristic. So 5 is an example, and that would be a population characteristic. You were able to ask everybody. C, what is the median price of a home in our town? If we came up with $150,000, that's a sample statistic. We didn't ask every single person. D, how many pets do people own in my neighborhood? 1 pet. Either a population characteristic or a sample statistic could be used depending on the method used to collect the data. Okay, if you lived in a rural area, you could ask everybody, that'd be population. If you lived in a city and there were high rises and you could not possibly go to every single apartment, then you would use a sample. E, what is the typical number of absences in math class at your school on a given day? And if it was, say the answer was 4 absences all day in all 2 or 3 classes, then mean or median representing typical, that would be a population characteristic, because you would ask every single teacher in your school. And F, what is the typical lifespan of a particular brand of flashlight battery? And let's just say it were something like 54 hours, that would be a sample statistic. Okay? You can't do it to the whole population because then you don't have any batteries on. G, what percentage of girls and boys in your school have a curfew? So if it said 65% of the girls and 58% of the boys had a curfew, either a population characteristic or a sample statistic, depending on the method of collecting your data. And finally, H, what is the most common blood type of students in my class? Type O positive is the most common, with 42% of the class having O positive. The class is the population, so the 42% would be a population characteristic. It could be possible to think of the class as a sample of all 7th graders, and then it would be a sample statistic. So it depends on what you're going to call your population. Okay, exercise 5. Population or sample. Indicate whether the following statements are summarizing data collected to answer a statistical question from a population or from a sample. Identify references in the statement as population characteristics or sample statistics. And A says 54% of the responders to a poll at a university indicated that wealth needed to be distributed more evenly among people. Okay, so in this case, the population would be all students attending the university. Poll respondents would be a sample, not the population. 54% would be a sample statistic. B, are students in the Bay Shore School District proficient on the state assessments in mathematics? In 2013, after all the tests taken by the students in the Bay Shore schools were evaluated, over 52% of those students were at or above proficient on the state assessment. So the population would be all of the students in the Bay Shore School District. 52% would be the population characteristic. C, does talking on mobile phones while driving distract people? Researchers measured the reaction times of 38 study participants as they talked on mobile phones and found that the average level of distraction from their driving was rated about 2.25 out of 5. Okay, the study participants would be a sample. All drivers would be the population. The 2.25 out of 5 would be a sample statistic. D, did most people living in New York in 2010 have at least a high school education? Based on the data collected from New York residents in 2010 by the US Census Bureau, 84.6% of people living in New York had at least a high school education. Okay, so the population is all of the people living in New York in 2010. The 84.6% would be a population characteristic. E, were there more deaths than births in the United States between July 2011 and July 2012? Data from the Health Service Agency indicated that there were 2% more deaths than births in the United States during that time frame. Okay, so here it says that this is a good question to discuss with students. The population would be all people in the United States, but the data probably came from a sample of the population. If necessary, point out to students that the nearly complete census of the United States did not occur in 2011 or 2012. The 2% would be a sample statistic. Although obtaining the number of births and deaths out of everyone in the United States would be possible for 2011 or 2012, it would be very difficult and is generally done when a national census is conducted. And those occur on every 10 years ending in 0. So there was a census in 2010. There will not be another census until 2020. Okay, F. What is the 5th best-selling book in the United States? Based on the sales of books in the U.S., the 5th best-selling book was Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss. So in this one, the population would be a list of all best-selling books in the United States using some subjective benchmark for best. The number of copies sold for each book would need to be known to determine the 5th best-selling book. So this is a population characteristic. Okay, one person's best is another person's worst. That's what they meant by subjective benchmark for best. Alright, exercise 6 through 8, census. When data are collected from the entire population, it is called a census. The United States takes a census of its population every 10 years, with the most recent one occurring in 2010. You can go to www.census.gov to find the history of the U.S. Census. A says to identify 3 things that you found to be interesting. Okay, so here's a few things. Students might suggest 1, the idea of a census dates back to ancient Egyptian times. That's pretty cool. 2, the U.S. Constitution mandates a census every 10 years. And 3, the first censuses only counted the number of men. And 4, until 1950, all of the counting was done manually. Holy cow, that's a lot of counting. All right, B, why is the census so important in the United States? Okay, according to the Constitution, the census is important for taxation purposes and in determining the number of representatives each state has in the House of Representatives. Other reasons might include planning for things such as roads and schools. Got to maintain that infrastructure. If you've been in D.C. recently, you see that infrastructure is failing due to the overpopulation. Okay, so now it says, go to the site census.gov 2010 census pop map blah blah blah. Select the state of New York. How many people are living in New York from 2010 census? And the answer is 19,378,102 people in 2010 lived in the state of New York. B says to estimate the ratio of those 65 and older to those under 18 years old. Why is this important to think about? Okay, the ratio is 2,627,943 to 4,324,929, or about 2.6 to 4.3. It is important because when there are a greater number of older people than younger people, there are fewer workers than people who have to be supported. Okay, so if you're retired, you are going to need Social Security possibly if you did not plan for your future, and Social Security comes from people who work and contribute to the Social Security out of their gross paychecks. And C, is the ratio a population characteristic or a statistic? Okay, the ratio is a population characteristic because it is based on data from the entire population in New York State. Okay, number 8. The American Community Survey, ACS, takes samples from a small percentage of the U.S. population in years between the censuses. There's a website for it. What is the difference between the way the ACS collects information about the U.S. population and the way the U.S. Census Bureau does? Okay, and looking that up, it says the ACS obtains its results from a small percentage of the U.S. population, while the Census Bureau attempts to obtain its results from the entire population. Suppose that from a sample of 200,000 New York workers, 32,400 reported having more than an hour to work each day. Traveling more than an hour to work each day. Their commute took over an hour to get to work. From this information, statisticians determined that between 16 and 16.4% of the workers in the state traveled more than an hour to work every day in 2011. If there were 8,437,512 workers in the entire population, about how many traveled more than an hour to work each day? Okay, and the answer is between 1,350,002 and 1,383,752 people. Now I need to go back, and it says, this should be here. What's the difference between the ACS and the U.S. Census? One takes a sample, one's the whole population. I skipped B, so let's go back to that now. In 2011, the ACS sampled workers living in New York about commuting to work each day. Why do you think these data are important for the state to know? So we already answered the question as how many did, but why do they need to know? Okay, and the answer is, in order to plan for the best ways to travel, communities need to know how many people are using the roads, which roads, whether they travel by public transportation, and so on, and so on, and so on. Okay, so these are all things that are necessary to know for a city to run smoothly. Okay. Okay, and D says, reasoning from a sample to the population is called making an inference about a population characteristic. Identify the statistic involved in making the inference in part C. So where do these numbers come from? Well, the sample statistic was 32,400 over 200,000, which is 16.2%. And E says the data about traveling time to work suggests that across the United States, typically between 79.8 and 80% of commuters travel alone, 10% to 10.2% carpool, and 4.9 to 5%. Okay, so in problem E, answers will vary. Reasons for differences largely depend on the type of community in which students live. Those living near a large metropolitan area such as Washington, D.C. or New York City may have lots of commuters using public transportation, while those living in other areas such as Milwaukee, Wisconsin do not have many public transportation options. Okay, so the lesson summary says, when data from a population are used to calculate a numerical summary, the value is called a population characteristic. Okay, population characteristic. My pen delayed there, that's why I delayed. When data from a sample are used to calculate numerical summary, the value is called a sample statistic. Sample statistics can be used to learn about population characteristics. That is the end of lesson 13. Go do your problem set.